Welcome to SLUMBERVERSE! Oh gee, another dimension of naps.
Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There are nights when the ocean holds its breath, when the waves forget their restless dance and settle into a mirror calm that reflects every star like captured wishes. On such a night, with the lighthouse beam sweeping its patient circle through salt-thick air, the sea brought River a gift wrapped in mystery and moonlight. The pregnant woman appeared at the cottage door as if the tide had carried her there, her dark hair tangled with seaweed and her eyes holding depths that spoke of journeys too strange for words. River, keeper of the lighthouse for more years than the village children had been alive, opened the door without question. Some arrivals announce themselves with thunder. Others whisper their way into your life like morning mist. This woman was the latter, carrying herself with the careful grace of someone protecting something precious. She spoke only once before settling into the small room River prepared. The child will be called Sage. Her voice held the rhythm of distant tides, and River simply nodded, understanding that some truths arrive complete, requiring no explanation. The midwife, a woman named Coral, whose hands had guided half the coastal children into the world, arrived as if summoned by the wind itself. She moved through the cottage with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to work alongside mystery without demanding it reveal itself. The birth came gently, more like sunrise than storm, and when Sage emerged into the lamplit world, Coral's weathered face creased into a smile that held no surprise, only recognition. The baby's first cry was soft, almost musical, but it was not the sound that made everyone pause. It was the sight of tiny fists, each clutching something impossible. Small pieces of amber that glowed with inner warmth, pulsing in rhythm with the newborn's heartbeat. The lighthouse beam swept overhead, and in its passing, the amber caught the light and threw it back transformed, painting the cottage walls with dancing shadows that looked almost like memories trying to remember themselves. Coral cleaned the amber pieces with the same gentle care she used for the baby, counting 7 perfect fragments, each no larger than a child's thumbnail. They were warm to the touch and seemed to hum with a frequency just below hearing, like the sound of contentment made tangible. The mysterious woman smiled once, kissed Sage's forehead with lips that tasted of salt and secrets, and by dawn had vanished like sea foam, leaving only the faint scent of distant shores and the gift of a child who had arrived carrying pieces of ancient sunlight. River learned quickly that Sage was different, not in any alarming way, but in the manner of morning light that appears ordinary, until you notice how it transforms everything it touches. The baby rarely cried, preferring instead a contemplative quiet that felt ancient and wise. When fussing did occur, the amber pieces would pulse brighter, and a wave of peace would settle over the cottage, touching every corner with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace. As weeks became months, more amber appeared, as if drawn by some invisible current to find its way to Sage. River would discover new pieces tucked into blankets, scattered around the crib, or nestled in the folds of tiny clothes like shy creatures seeking shelter. Each piece seemed to carry its own quiet story. And Sage, even as an infant, would cup them with reverent care, dark eyes growing distant, as if listening to whispers only they could hear. The lighthouse cat, a grey shadow named Keeper, took to sleeping beside Sage's crib, purring in harmony with the amber's gentle hum. Visitors to the lighthouse began commenting on the unusual peace they felt within the cottage walls, how their worries seemed to settle like dust in still air. Children who came with their parents would gravitate towards Sage, drawn by something they couldn't name, sitting quietly beside the growing collection, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. By the time Sage could walk, their connection to the amber had deepened into something that felt more like remembering than learning. Small hands would select pieces with careful consideration, and in those moments of contact, the child's eyes would fill with a wonder that seemed too vast for such a young face. River began to understand that Sage wasn't simply collecting amber. They were listening to it, learning from it, becoming fluent in a language older than words. The first clear glimpse of the gift came on a storm-tossed afternoon when Sage, barely 3, pressed a piece of amber to their cheek and described with startling clarity the ancient forest where it had formed. The lazy summer day when tree sap had caught a tiny insect mid-dance, River felt a shiver of recognition, understanding that this child could somehow touch the preserved moments within the golden resin, experiencing echoes of time long past. With this realization came the first shadow of what would later grow into something more complex. River noticed how Sage's small hands would tighten around the amber when strangers approached, how the child's eyes would dart anxiously to the collection if anyone showed too much interest. It was subtle, this protective instinct, tender rather than fierce, but it carried within it the seed of something that might one day need gentle tending, a love so deep it bordered on possession, a need to keep safe what felt too precious to risk losing. The lighthouse beam continued its endless sweep, marking time in 30-second intervals, and under its watchful light, Sage grew surrounded by fragments of eternity, learning to listen to the whispers of preserved time, while the first quiet stirrings of the monster within began their patient, almost imperceptible dance in the amber-lit shadows of a keeper's cottage by the sea. The seasons turned like pages in a book written by tides, and with each passing month, Sage's connection to the amber deepened from curiosity into something that felt more like remembering than learning. By their 5th year, the child had developed what River came to think of as a translator's patience, the ability to sit quietly with a piece of golden resin and listen until its ancient story began to unfold like a flower opening to morning light. River crafted a special wooden box, lined with soft cloth, calling it the resting place, where new pieces of amber could settle and adjust to their new home before joining the growing collection. Sage learned to wait with each arrival, understanding instinctively that some stories needed time to trust before they would share themselves. The ritual became sacred. A new piece would rest for 3 days and 3 nights while Sage would visit it each morning, not touching, just sitting nearby with the kind of reverent attention usually reserved for sleeping babies or prayer. When the time felt right, Sage would lift the amber with careful hands, and their dark eyes would grow distant, as if looking through windows into yesterday. The first clear translation came on a morning when fog wrapped the lighthouse in grey silk. Sage held a piece containing a perfectly preserved leaf and whispered, "It wasn't falling, it was dancing." The tree was teaching it how to let go beautifully, and the golden tears caught it mid-spin so the dance could last forever. River learned to recognize the signs of successful communion, how Sage's breathing would slow and synchronize with some unheard rhythm, the way their small hands would warm as if drawing heat from ancient summers, the expression of wonder that seemed borrowed from somewhere far older than 5 years could contain. Through the child's gift, River discovered that each piece held not just physical specimens, but emotional impressions, the contentment of morning dew, the patient determination of tree sap flowing toward its destiny, the quiet satisfaction of time accepting its own transformation into eternity. These translations became their morning ritual. After checking the lighthouse lamp, and before the day's simple tasks began, River and Sage would sit together among the growing collection, while the child selected a piece with the careful deliberation of a scholar choosing texts. "This one remembers summer rain," Sage might say, or "This tiny bug was so happy to be flying when the golden sleep came." Each story was a gift, a glimpse into moments so ancient they predated human memory, yet somehow felt familiar as breathing. The amber pieces continued their mysterious arrivals, appearing with the quiet persistence of morning dew. River would find them tucked into Sage's pockets after walks along the shore, nestled on windowsills after moonlit nights, or discovered among the lighthouse cat's favorite sleeping spots, as if Keeper himself were part of the amber's patient conspiracy. Each piece seemed to choose its moment of revelation, arriving when Sage was ready to hear its particular story. But as autumn painted the coastal village in shades of rust and gold, River began to notice subtle changes in their young charge. The child's attachment to the collection was deepening beyond appreciation into something more protective, more anxious. When village children came to visit, Sage would hover near the amber boxes, small body tense with worry that curious hands might disturb what felt too precious to risk. Sleep became restless, interrupted by dreams of amber pieces rolling away into darkness or dissolving like sugar in rain. "What if they get lost?" Sage asked one grey afternoon, voice tight with worry that seemed too large for such young shoulders. What if I can't hear them anymore? Or what if someone takes them away? The questions tumbled out in a torrent of fear that made River's heart ache with recognition. They had seen this before in lighthouse keepers, who loved their beacon so much they forgot it was meant to guide ships away. Not hold them close, River gathered the child near, feeling the rapid flutter of a frightened heart. Sweet one, the amber has been waiting millions of years to find you. Do you think it would let itself be lost so easily now? But even as River offered comfort, they recognized the signs of something growing in the shadows of Sage's love, a beautiful gift beginning to cast its own shadow, a need to possess what was meant to be experienced. The lighthouse beam swept its patient circle overhead, marking time with the same steady rhythm it had maintained for generations. But inside the cottage, time seemed to be gathering itself into knots of anxiety and wonder. Sage began checking on the collection multiple times throughout the day, counting pieces with methodical care, arranging and rearranging them as if the perfect order might somehow make them safe forever. In the amber-lit evenings that followed, River watched with growing understanding as love and fear began their ancient dance in a child's heart. The monster within was still small, still gentle, but it was learning to speak in Sage's own voice, using protection as its grammar and devotion as its vocabulary. The gift that brought such wonder was also teaching the pain of potential loss, and River began to plan how they might help the child learn the difference between treasuring something and imprisoning it, before the beautiful collection became its own golden cage. River's prayers for guidance seemed to arrive with the morning tide, carried on the weathered boots of old Coral, whose boat appeared through the dawn mist, like an answer the sea had been preparing for years. The fisherman had been part of the coastal rhythm longer than the lighthouse itself, his hands mapped with scars from nets and weather, his eyes holding the patient depth of someone who had learned to read the ocean's moods like scripture. He came bearing gifts that smelled of salt and thyme, smooth pieces of sea glass worn tender by countless journeys, driftwood carved into impossible shapes by waves and sand, and nestled among them, pieces of amber that had traveled different paths than Sage's forest treasures. Sage watched from the cottage window as Coral's small boat cut through water so still it might have been polished glass, and something in the child's chest tightened with familiar anxiety. Another visitor meant another person who might want to touch the collection, might ask questions, might somehow threaten the careful order that kept the amber safe. Small hands pressed against the window glass, leaving foggy prints that looked like worry made visible. But when Coral approached the cottage, his greeting carried none of the eager curiosity that made Sage retreat. "Morning, little keeper," he called, voice carrying the rhythm of waves against stone. "I've brought some friends who've been asking to meet you." From his canvas bag, he withdrew 3 pieces of amber, unlike any in Sage's collection. These glowed with a different light, cloudier and more mysterious, holding within them not the sharp clarity of forest memories, but the fluid impressions of oceanic time. Instead of the reaching hands River had come to expect, Sage stepped back, small body tense with uncertainty. "What if they don't like me?" the child whispered, eyes wide with a fear that seemed too complex for 7 years to hold. "What if I can't understand what they're trying to say? Or what if listening to them makes my other pieces jealous?" Coral's weathered face creased into the kind of smile that had weathered countless storms. "Child, the sea doesn't ask permission to hold the moon's reflection. It simply opens itself and lets the light find its home." He settled onto the cottage steps with the careful grace of someone whose bones had learned to move with tidal rhythms. "These pieces have been traveling in the deep currents longer than you've been breathing, getting smooth and patient. Do you think they'd journey so far just to be disappointed when they finally arrived?" The first piece Coral offered looked like captured sea foam, swirling with patterns that seemed to move when viewed sideways. When Sage finally gathered courage to touch it, their small face transformed with wonder, but also confusion. "It's not telling me a story," the child said, voice puzzled. "It's singing something, but I can't understand the words." "Ocean amber speaks differently than forest amber," Coral explained, his voice gentle as tide pools. "Forest pieces remember specific moments, a leaf falling, an insect dancing. But ocean pieces remember feelings, movements, the way water holds everything while letting everything go." He showed Sage how to listen with different ears, not for words but for rhythms, not for pictures, but for the sensation of vast, patient currents. Through that long afternoon, Coral taught lessons that River had struggled to find words for. He spoke in the language of tides and seasons, explaining how the ocean was the world's greatest collector, gathering treasures from every shore and holding them not with grasping hands, but with patient currents that polished and shaped and sometimes released. "The sea knows a secret," Coral murmured as Sage explored the second piece of amber. "To keep something truly safe, you must let it breathe. The tightest grip crushes what it means to protect." The second piece held the ghost impression of something that might once have been a shell, now transformed into swirling patterns that looked like frozen music. Sage held it carefully, learning to listen for the ocean's different kind of story. "It remembers being carried," the child said slowly, understanding dawning like sunrise. "Not trapped, but traveling." The water held it gently while it became something new. As evening painted the lighthouse in shades of amber and rose, Coral shared stories of other collectors who had learned the sea's lessons. There was the woman who gathered shells, but always returned the most beautiful ones to the waves, understanding that some treasures were meant to continue their journeys. There was the man who collected driftwood, but carved it into boats for children, sending his treasures on new adventures rather than holding them captive on shelves. "Your forest amber chose you," Coral explained, as darkness deepened around them. "But choosing and owning are different currents entirely. The sea chooses every shore it touches, but it doesn't try to carry the beaches away." His words settled into Sage's mind like seeds finding fertile soil, beginning the slow work of teaching the difference between love and possession. The third piece of amber was the largest, holding what appeared to be a perfect bubble of ancient air, still and eternal yet somehow alive with possibility. When Sage held it, tears gathered in dark eyes, not from sadness but from a joy too large for words. "It's still breathing," the child whispered. "Even after all this time, it's still holding space for something beautiful to happen." That night, as Coral's boat disappeared into darkness and the lighthouse beam resumed its patient sweep, Sage sat among the collection with new eyes. The forest amber still hummed its familiar songs, but now the child could hear something else beneath those melodies, the distant, patient rhythm of tides, whispering of release and transformation. The monster within had not vanished, but Coral's visit had planted seeds of wisdom that might grow into understanding, that true keeping sometimes meant letting go, that the deepest love often expressed itself through trust rather than control, and that the sea's greatest treasures were those it shared rather than hoarded in its depths. The wisdom Coral had planted in Sage's heart grew slowly through the weeks that followed, like sea glass tumbling in patient currents until sharp edges became smooth. The child still counted the amber pieces each morning, but the frantic urgency had softened into something more like a gentle inventory, fingers brushing each specimen with gratitude rather than desperate possession. River noticed this change in the quality of attention, the way Sage now paused to listen before reaching, as if asking permission from the amber itself before disturbing its rest. It was during one of these quiet morning rituals that the letter arrived, carried by Coral's weathered hands, along with the scent of salt and distant shores. The envelope bore River's name in careful script, and the return address spoke of a traveling curator named Moss, who specialized in what they called collections of wonder. River read the letter twice before sharing its contents, watching Sage's face for signs of the old anxiety returning. "They've heard about your gift," River explained gently, settling beside Sage among the amber-lit morning shadows. "Not to take anything away, but to understand how listening works. They say they've spent years learning what you seem to have been born knowing." The letter spoke of other collections, other keepers who had found ways to share their treasures without losing them, and River could see the seed of possibility taking root in Sage's careful consideration. When Moss arrived 3 days later, they came not with the eager curiosity that made Sage retreat, but with the patient presence of someone who understood that sacred spaces required permission to enter. Tall and angular, with silver-streaked hair that caught light like spider silk, Moss carried a leather satchel that clinked softly with each step, suggesting treasures that had learned to move quietly together. They paused at the cottage gate, hands folded, waiting for invitation rather than assuming welcome. "I've come to learn," Moss said simply when River opened the door, and those 4 words carried more respect than all the elaborate courtesies Sage had heard from other visitors. "If you're willing to teach me how to listen the way you do, I might be able to show you how others could learn to listen too, without disturbing what shouldn't be disturbed. The first day passed in careful observation. Moss sat quietly while Sage went through the morning ritual, never reaching for the amber, but watching with the kind of attention that felt like being truly seen. When Sage finally offered to share one piece, a forest specimen containing a delicate fern frond, Moss received it with hands that understood the weight of trust, holding it as if it were made of crystallized breath. It wasn't trying to be caught, Sage explained, a voice gaining confidence as understanding dawned in Moss's attentive eyes. The fern was just living its quiet life, unfurling in dappled sunlight, when the tree's golden tears came flowing down. But see how peaceful it looks? The amber didn't trap it. It offered a different way to keep growing, slower and more forever. Moss nodded with the careful attention of someone receiving instructions for handling something infinitely precious. I've studied thousands of specimens, they murmured, but I never thought to ask what they felt about their preservation. You're teaching me to see with different hearts. From the leather satchel came tools that looked more like instruments of reverence than science. A magnifying glass with a driftwood handle, soft linen cloths, small wooden stands carved to cradle rather than display. Through the afternoon that followed, they began the delicate work of creating what Moss called listening spaces, not museum displays that demanded attention, but quiet arrangements that invited contemplation. River contributed pieces of smooth driftwood that Coral had brought, their surfaces polished by countless tides, into perfect cradles for the amber. Sage learned to write small cards in careful script, not describing what the amber contained, but offering questions that might help visitors find their own listening. What season does this light remind you of? Or what would you whisper to something that has been waiting this long to be heard? The first visitors came hesitantly, drawn by word that something beautiful was happening at the lighthouse cottage. Sage watched from behind River's reading chair, heart hammering with equal measures of fear and fascination, as strangers approached the amber with the reverence the displays seemed to request. A baker's wife stood before a piece containing an ancient leaf and whispered, "It remembers the last dance before falling." Two children approached hand in hand, and one began to cry without knowing why, while the other squeezed their fingers and said, "Fate feels like being chosen by something shy and wonderful. Not every moment was graceful." A tourist with loud shoes reached out impulsively, drawn by shine rather than story, and Sage's breath caught in familiar panic. But Moss stepped forward with gentle authority, offering their own hands as a guide. "Try this," they suggested softly, placing the reaching palm on the linen beside the amber. "Let your eyes do the touching while your heart does the listening." The grasping hand slowly relaxed into stillness, and Sage's lungs remembered to work again. As evening painted the cottage in shades of amber and rose, Sage sat among the collection with a feeling too complex for simple words. The pieces were all still there, unchanged and safe, but something in the room felt larger, more alive, as if the amber had learned new songs from the hearts that had witnessed them. "They didn't take anything," Sage said wonderingly, "but somehow there's more here than there was this morning." Moss smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had helped plant seeds in fertile ground. When wonder is shared carefully, it grows roots in new soil. The stories your amber holds are finding new homes in the people who heard them today. But that doesn't make them any less yours. The words settled into Sage's understanding like gentle rain, beginning the slow work of teaching that possession and sharing might not be enemies after all, but different expressions of the same deep love. The monster within listened too, finding that its protective instincts had been honored without being allowed to rule, and in that recognition, it began its own patient transformation toward something wiser and more generous than fear. The wisdom that Coral and Moss had planted in Sage's heart took root slowly, like sea glass tumbling in patient currents, until sharp edges became smooth. Through the weeks that followed their first successful sharing, the cottage learned a new rhythm. Mornings began with gentle preparation of the listening spaces, afternoons welcomed soft footsteps and wondering eyes, and evenings folded everything back into grateful rest. Sage moved through these days with a steadiness that hadn't been there before, carrying the amber with hands that had learned to feel for the pulse of trust rather than the grip of fear. Yet as summer deepened and the collection continued its mysterious arrivals, something subtle began to shift in the quality of Sage's attention. What had started as careful sharing slowly transformed into something more consuming, a growing sense that every moment of wonder witnessed in the cottage was somehow their responsibility to preserve. The monster within, which had seemed to be learning wisdom through Coral's ocean lessons and Moss's gentle guidance, discovered instead a new vocabulary for its ancient appetite, speaking now not of protection, but of sacred duty. River noticed the change first in how Sage moved through their morning rituals. Where once the child had selected amber pieces with contemplative care, now there was an urgency, a restless searching that seemed to ask not, "What story does this hold?" but "What stories am I failing to capture?" The wooden resting box overflowed with specimens that Sage couldn't bear to leave unexplored, even for the traditional 3 days of settling. Sleep became fitful, interrupted by dreams of moments slipping away unpreserved, of beauty dying because no amber was there to catch it in golden suspension. The cottage itself began to reflect this shift from appreciation to acquisition. Every surface hosted amber pieces in various stages of organization, and Sage developed systems within systems, forest specimens arranged by the season of their preservation, ocean pieces sorted by the clarity of their contained mysteries, newer arrivals waiting in anxious queues for their turn to be properly heard and catalogued. The peaceful rhythm that had once marked their days fragmented into frantic inventory, with Sage moving from piece to piece like a gardener convinced that constant attention was the only thing preventing flowers from wilting. But it wasn't just the amber that called to Sage's increasingly desperate need to preserve. Walking the shore one morning, they discovered a perfect spiral shell and spent the afternoon carefully coating it in clear resin, hoping to capture its delicate architecture forever. Wildflowers that had once been pressed gently in books were now encased in glass, their colors held in perpetual but somehow breathless bloom. River would find Sage arranging pebbles on the beach in patterns meant to outlast the tide, or attempting to capture the scent of blooming roses in sealed jars. "It's so beautiful," Sage would murmur during these attempts, eyes distant and hands trembling slightly. Too beautiful to just disappear. The gift that had once felt like gentle communion with ancient stories now felt like overwhelming responsibility for preventing any beauty from being lost to time's relentless current. Every sunset carried colors that should be caught in amber. Every child's laugh contained joy, too precious to let fade into memory. Every moment of grace deserved eternal witnessing. Moss, who had been visiting weekly to help refine the listening spaces, began to arrive with expressions of gentle concern rather than collaborative excitement. "The amber seems restless," they observed one gray afternoon, watching Sage rearrange the same display for the third time in an hour. Not the pieces themselves, but the energy around them. "It feels less like a sanctuary, and more like a place where beauty is being asked to work too hard." The collection itself seemed to respond to Sage's growing desperation. Pieces that had once hummed with contentment now felt heavy with expectation, their golden light somehow dimmer, as if the weight of being responsible for preserving all beauty was too much even for ancient resin to bear. Visitors began to comment on the change, describing the cottage as feeling too full or trying too hard, though they couldn't quite articulate what had shifted in the amber-lit spaces that had once felt so peaceful. River watched this growing intensity with the patient ache of someone who had seen fog try to hold a coastline. One evening, as Sage meticulously catalogued a new collection of fossilized leaves, River sat beside them, the rhythmic creak of the lighthouse mechanism the only sound breaking the cottage's breathless quiet. "Sweet one," River began softly, "your collection is a wonder, but not everything needs to be kept in amber to be cherished. Some things are meant to live once and then become part of us in different ways." Sage paused, fingers hovering over a delicate fossil. "But if I don't keep it, River, it will be gone. Like the sunset or the wave, it will just vanish, and then it's like it never happened at all." The words carried a quiet desperation that made the air feel thinner, a fear so profound it seemed to press against the cottage walls. That night, surrounded by hundreds of amber pieces that no longer felt like treasures, but like responsibilities too heavy to bear, Sage sat in the amber-tinted darkness while the lighthouse beam swept its patient circle overhead. The monster within had grown fat on good intentions, convincing itself that love meant never letting go, that preservation was the only proof of caring. Somewhere in the golden glow, beauty had become a burden, and the gift of hearing ancient whispers had transformed into the terrible weight of trying to silence time itself. The cottage had become a beautiful prison, each amber piece now feeling less like a treasure and more like a responsibility too heavy for one heart to carry. Sage moved through the crowded rooms, like someone trying to hold water in cupped hands. The harder they grasped for control over beauty and time, the more peace seemed to slip through their fingers. The monster within had grown so large on good intentions and desperate love that even breathing felt like disturbing something sacred, and the amber pieces themselves seemed to pulse with a restlessness that spoke of longing for space and light. River found Sage one morning surrounded by catalogues and careful arrangements, small shoulders bent under the weight of trying to preserve every moment of wonder the world offered. The lighthouse keeper settled beside them with the patience of someone who had watched many storms pass, understanding that sometimes healing requires room to breathe and light to move freely. "What if we brought some of the amber outside?" River asked gently, voice carrying the rhythm of tides. Not to abandon them, but to let them remember what it feels like to dance with natural light again. The idea terrified and intrigued Sage in equal measure. Outside meant weather, meant change, meant the possibility of loss that had become the monster's favorite lullaby of fear. But the cottage walls seemed to press closer each day, thick with preserved beauty that somehow felt breathless, and even the amber appeared to yearn for something. The careful indoor displays could never provide. Moss arrived that afternoon with lengths of silver rope and driftwood branches weathered smooth by countless storms, their surfaces perfect for catching light without competing with amber's golden glow. Coral appeared soon after, bringing glass floats and the kind of weathered wisdom that made difficult decisions feel possible. Together they began the delicate work of transformation, not as rescue, but as gentle expansion of breath. The garden grew slowly in the sheltered space behind the lighthouse, each piece requiring Sage to wrestle with whispered warnings about exposure and vulnerability. River helped drill tiny holes and thread fishing line with the patience their gift had taught them, creating hanging displays that would let each specimen move gently in the breeze while remaining safely tethered. The first piece they hung was one of Coral's ocean specimens, and watching it catch the afternoon sun felt like releasing a held breath that had been trapped for months. Something magical happened as more pieces joined the outdoor display. Instead of feeling diminished by the open air, the amber seemed to come alive in ways the cottage's careful control had never allowed. Sunlight moved through the specimens like liquid music, casting dancing shadows that told stories of their own, while gentle breezes set the hanging pieces in motion, creating a symphony of tiny chimes as they occasionally touched. The lighthouse beam swept overhead each evening, and the amber answered with warm pulses of honeyed light, a chorus of ancient suns remembering their dance with living sky. Word of the amber garden spread through the coastal village with the quiet persistence of morning mist. People began arriving not as tourists seeking spectacle, but as pilgrims drawn by something they couldn't quite name, a space where time seemed to move differently, where the boundary between preservation and presence blurred into something approaching grace. They came carrying their own stories of loss and beauty, and found in the hanging amber a place where such feelings felt understood rather than desperate. Sage began to understand that the garden was teaching lessons the cottage never could. Watching visitors move through the suspended specimens, they saw how beauty shared in open air somehow multiplied rather than diminished, how stories told to sympathetic listeners grew richer rather than thinner through the telling. The monster within, which had fed on the fear of loss, found itself confused by this new mathematics where giving away seemed to result in having more. It was during one of these wandering afternoons that Wren first appeared, moving through the garden with the quiet attention of someone who understood that sacred spaces spoke in whispers. Young and spare, with paint-stained fingers and eyes that held the patient depth of forest pools, they carried a worn satchel and sketchbook, but approached the amber not with the eager curiosity of collectors, but with the reverent observation of someone who had learned to listen with more than just their ears. Wren set up an easel among the hanging specimens and began to paint the garden not as it appeared, but as it felt, all flowing light and gentle movement, colors bleeding into each other like emotions too complex for boundaries. They worked in watercolors, letting pigment bloom and fade across wet paper in patterns that captured something the amber couldn't: the quality of change itself, the beauty of impermanence made visible in flowing color. When afternoon rain began to fall, Sage rushed outside to warn about the watercolors, but found Wren smiling as drops transformed the painting in real time, creating effects no brush could have achieved. "It's still beautiful," Wren said simply, watching colors run and blend in patterns that would never be repeated. "Different beautiful, but not less." The words settled into Sage's understanding, like seeds finding fertile soil, beginning the slow work of teaching that preservation and change might not be enemies after all, but dance partners in beauty's endless choreography. In the amber garden, surrounded by hanging light and gentle movement, the monster within began to feel confused by these new lessons, its vocabulary of fear and possession, struggling to make sense of beauty that grew stronger through sharing, preservation that happened through release, keeping that expressed itself through letting go. The wisdom Wren had planted through their rain-transformed paintings took root slowly in Sage's heart, like morning dew settling into thirsty earth. Through the days that followed, the young artist returned to the amber garden with quiet persistence, setting up their easel in different corners and painting the hanging specimens as they moved through changing light. Sage began to watch these sessions with a fascination that felt different from the desperate hunger that had once driven their collecting. This was curiosity without grasping, wonder without the need to possess. Wren worked with a patience that seemed borrowed from tides themselves, letting watercolors find their own relationships on wet paper, accepting accidents as gifts rather than failures. When afternoon breezes would scatter the amber's dancing shadows across a half-finished painting, Wren would smile and follow the new patterns, teaching Sage through gentle example that collaboration with change could create beauty that control never could. The lesson settled into Sage's understanding, like seeds finding fertile ground. The amber garden itself seemed to respond to this new energy, the hanging specimens catching light in ways that felt more generous, more alive. Visitors began arriving with their own creative offerings. A baker's daughter brought pressed flowers for temporary arrangements. An old fisherman created shell patterns meant for the tide to claim. The space was learning to breathe with the rhythm of sharing rather than hoarding, and Sage felt something in their chest begin to uncurl from its long-held tension. But it was River who first noticed the signs, written in cloud patterns and wind direction, the subtle shift in air pressure that spoke of weather, gathering strength across vast ocean distances. The lighthouse keeper had read such signs for decades, understanding when gentle preparation could make the difference between weathering and breaking. As afternoon light took on the peculiar quality that comes before storms, River began the quiet work of securing what could be protected while accepting what must face the tempest. Coral arrived as if summoned by the sea's own whispers, bringing weathered rope and the kind of calm presence that made difficult decisions feel possible. Moss appeared soon after with practical wisdom, suggesting they give the amber pieces choices rather than making decisions for them. Together, they moved through the garden like a careful dance, listening to each specimen's subtle song to determine which yearned for shelter and which seemed eager to dance with the coming weather. Some pieces hummed with quiet contentment when moved toward the cottage's protection, their golden light settling into peaceful rhythms. The others seemed to pulse brighter when left in the garden's open air, as if the approaching storm excited rather than frightened them. Sage learned to listen for these preferences, small hands growing steady as they helped arrange the amber according to its own desires rather than their fears. As darkness gathered and the first heavy drops began to fall, Sage felt the familiar monster stir in their chest, that ancient creature of possession and protection that had once filled the cottage with breathless preservation. "We should bring them all inside," Sage whispered, voice tight with the old desperation. "What if the storm breaks them? What if their stories are lost forever?" River's gentle hand found Sage's shoulder, steady and warm as lighthouse stone. "Sweet one," the keeper said softly, "the amber has survived millions of years of weather far fiercer than this. Some lessons can only be learned by trusting what we love to know its own strength." The words carried the patient wisdom of someone who had learned when to fight and when to have faith. The storm arrived, with the majesty of something that had been gathering power across endless ocean miles, wind singing through the garden's lines like a vast instrument learning its own voice. Rain began as scattered drops, then grew into sheets of silver that caught the lighthouse beam and threw it back in dancing patterns. The hanging amber swayed and pulsed, creating a symphony of light and gentle sound as pieces occasionally touched, chiming like distant bells. Sage stood at the cottage window, heart hammering as they watched the garden transform into something wild and beautiful. Some amber pieces danced with obvious joy, their movements graceful and unafraid. Others swayed with dignified patience, weathering the storm with ancient calm. And yes, some were claimed by particularly strong gusts, their lines slipping or breaking as they took flight into the rain-dark night. Instead of the crushing panic Sage expected, something unexpected bloomed in their chest, a strange, bright relief. The pieces hadn't been stolen or destroyed. They had simply accepted the storm's invitation to join a larger dance. Wren, who had remained to paint the tempest, captured not the loss but the beauty of release. Watercolors flowing across paper, like emotions too complex for words. When morning painted the world in shades of pearl and rose, the garden revealed its transformation. Some amber was indeed gone, returned to the sea's patient keeping or scattered to become part of other shores' treasures. But the remaining pieces seemed somehow more alive, their surfaces cleaned by rain, and their positions rearranged by wind into patterns no human planning could have achieved. Standing among the storm-changed garden, Sage understood what River had been trying to teach through patient example. The amber pieces that had been claimed by weather weren't lost. They had simply returned to the world's larger collection, their stories becoming part of the storm's own narrative. The memories they had held weren't destroyed but transformed, scattered like seeds to take root in new hearts, perhaps to be discovered by other listeners in other times. The monster within, which had fed so long on the fear of loss, found itself confused by this new mathematics, where letting go sometimes meant keeping more truly than grasping ever could. The lighthouse beam swept overhead in its eternal rhythm, and the remaining amber answered with warm pulses of honeyed light, not preservation fighting time, but ancient patience learning to dance gracefully within time's endless, beautiful flow. The storm had left the garden transformed, not broken but somehow more honest, like a face that has learned to show its weathering as part of its beauty. In the pearl-soft light of morning, Sage walked among the rearranged specimens with steps that felt lighter, as if the weight of trying to preserve every moment had been lifted by wind and rain and redistributed to the world where it belonged. The remaining amber pieces seemed more vibrant, their golden light pulsing with the quiet contentment of survivors who had discovered their own resilience in the dance with tempest. Wren returned before the grass finished drying, easel tucked under one arm, and a thermos that smelled of chamomile and honey warming their paint-stained hands. They moved through the changed garden with the reverent attention of someone reading a poem that had rewritten itself overnight, setting up quietly among the storm-chosen arrangements. When they began to paint, it wasn't the amber itself they captured, but the quality of space around it, how light moved differently through patterns no human planning could have achieved, how shadows fell in graceful acceptance of their new positions. Something inside Sage loosened as they watched Wren work, the way knots sometimes release when touched by patient warmth. They fetched thick slices of bread and a jar of elderflower jam, then hesitated and added cheese, then hesitated again and brought another plate. "For the wind," Wren said with gentle humor when they saw the extra portions, and they shared the simple meal as if the breeze might steal a bite if they ate too slowly. The food tasted like permission to be ordinary in the presence of wonder. Through the days that followed, their friendship deepened beyond artist and observer into something more tender and patient. Wren would arrive each morning with fresh watercolors, painting the garden as it learned to be itself again, while Sage learned to sit nearby without the old desperate need to explain or protect. They developed quiet rituals that knitted themselves into comfort, walking the shoreline without collecting anything at all, watching Wren sketch shapes in wet sand that the tide would complete in its own way, sharing afternoons when the lighthouse beam turned hanging amber into gentle lanterns. "You don't try to keep the colors from changing," Sage observed one afternoon, watching watercolor bloom across wet paper in patterns that would never repeat exactly. "Even when they're beautiful, you let them become something else." The words carried wonder rather than anxiety, as if speaking a truth that had been waiting patiently to be recognized. Wren paused, brush poised above a wash of amber-colored paint that was slowly bleeding into rose. The colors teach me that beauty isn't something to trap, but something to dance with. Each painting is different because each moment is different, and that's what makes them precious. Not that they last forever, but that they happen at all. Their voice held the gentle wisdom of someone who had learned to trust the intelligence of flowing things. This philosophy began to seep into Sage's understanding. Like gentle rain soaking thirsty ground, they learned to watch Ren's paintings change and fade without the old panic, discovering instead a deeper appreciation for how many different forms of loveliness one creation could hold. When afternoon light would shift and transform a watercolor's appearance, Sage felt not loss but wonder at the endless conversation between permanence and change. The amber garden became a place where these lessons took root and grew. Visitors arrived not just to witness preserved moments, but to experience the ongoing dance between keeping and releasing. Children would create temporary patterns with shells and sea glass, understanding instinctively what Sage was slowly learning, that some beauty was meant to be built and rebuilt, experienced and released. Adults would sit quietly among the hanging amber, finding in its gentle movement a peace that rigid displays had never offered. It was Moss who suggested the memory bowl, arriving one afternoon with a piece of driftwood, worn smooth by countless tides, and carved into a perfect vessel. "If this light reminds you of something," read the small sign Sage carefully lettered, "how you can tell it here." People didn't rush toward the bowl but drifted close and away, then returned with folded notes like shy creatures emerging from hiding. A grandfather wrote about holding his newborn in sunlit kitchen warmth. A child wrote about dreams of swimming inside clouds. A woman wrote simply, "It feels like my mother's laugh," when she forgot to be careful. Ren began bringing different kinds of paper, some that absorbed watercolor in permanent stains, others that let pigment flow and fade with each application of moisture. They taught Sage to appreciate both the comfort of marks that would endure and the grace of impressions that honored their own temporary nature. Together, they created small collaborative pieces, Sage selecting amber specimens to inspire Ren's flowing colors, both learning that creation shared was somehow more complete than creation hoarded. As autumn painted the coastal village in shades of rust and gold, Sage and Ren developed rituals that honored both keeping and releasing. They would select amber pieces for temporary outdoor arrangements, creating installations that would last only until the next storm or strong wind rearranged them into new conversations with light. Ren painted these ephemeral displays in watercolors that were themselves temporary, creating layers of impermanence that somehow felt more alive than any permanent exhibition. One evening, as the lighthouse beam swept its patient circle overhead and painted the garden in moving shadows, Sage sat among the amber with a feeling too complex for simple words. The collection was smaller now. Some pieces had been gifted to visitors whose hearts had truly heard their stories. Others had been returned to Coral for his ocean journeys, and still others had simply departed with weather or time. Yet somehow the space felt fuller rather than emptier, alive with the stories that had been shared rather than hoarded. "I used to think keeping meant never letting go," Sage said softly, watching Ren clean brushes in a jar of water that caught and scattered the amber's golden light. "But maybe keeping really means loving something enough to let it become what it needs to become, even if that means changing or leaving." The words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom, spoken with the quiet authority of someone who had wrestled with angels and learned their names. Ren smiled with the gentle satisfaction of someone who had helped plant seeds in fertile ground. "The paintings teach me the same thing. The most beautiful moments happen when I stop trying to control what the colors do and start trusting them to find their own way." They swirled the brush in water until amber and rose and gold danced together in patterns that would never be repeated, a small demonstration of the beauty that lived in letting go. That night, as darkness settled over the garden like a gentle blanket, Sage felt the monster within stirring not with hunger or fear, but with something approaching curiosity. The creature of possession and protection was learning new vocabulary, discovering that love might express itself not through grasping but through the courage to trust, not through preservation, but through the grace of allowing beloved things their own journey through time's patient, endless dance. In the amber-tinted darkness, surrounded by light that moved like breathing, Sage understood that transformation was not the enemy of treasure, but its most faithful companion. The wisdom that had taken root in Sage's heart through storm lessons and watercolor teachings continued to grow through the quiet weeks that followed, like morning light gradually filling a room until shadows became friends rather than hiding places. The amber garden breathed with newfound freedom, each hanging specimen catching light with a generosity that seemed to invite rather than guard. And Sage moved through the transformed space with steps that carried wonder instead of worry. The monster within, which had once prowled with hungry protection, now rested like a contented cat, stirring only to purr approval when visitors found genuine connection with the ancient stories. It was Moss who returned on a morning when fog wrapped the lighthouse in silver silk, their weathered satchel clinking softly with new treasures, and their eyes holding the patient excitement of someone who had been dreaming practical dreams. They walked through the storm-changed garden with the reverent attention of a scholar reading poetry that had rewritten itself overnight, pausing to observe how wind and weather had created arrangements no human planning could have achieved. When they finally settled on the cottage steps beside River and Sage, their words carried the weight of careful consideration. "What you've created here transcends collection," Moss said softly, watching how afternoon light moved through the hanging amber like liquid music. "This garden has become a living conversation between time and heart, where preservation serves connection rather than possession. I've been wondering if such wisdom might flourish under a roof as well, in a space where people could listen regardless of weather or season." Their voice held the gentle enthusiasm of someone who understood that sacred work required patient cultivation rather than eager rushing. The idea that emerged through their afternoon conversation felt less like building something new and more like allowing something that already existed to take visible form. River knew of a small annex to the lighthouse keeper's cottage, unused for decades, but filled with the kind of weathered character that made spaces feel welcoming before any decoration was added. The rooms were modest but well-proportioned, with windows that caught morning light and walls that had absorbed enough sea air to feel naturally peaceful. Wren arrived as if summoned by creative possibility, moving through the empty rooms with the quiet attention of someone reading the bones of a poem waiting to be written. They sketched plans not for displays but for experiences, designing spaces that would invite contemplation rather than demand attention. Each room could hold a different quality of listening, Wren suggested, watercolor brush poised above paper as ideas took visual form. Forest light here, ocean depths there, and perhaps a space that feels like dawn, where people can sit with whatever the amber awakens in their own memories. The transformation happened gradually, with the same patient rhythm that had shaped the garden. Coral brought driftwood shelving that curved like gentle waves, surfaces that seemed to cradle rather than simply hold. River contributed practical wisdom about lighting and flow, ensuring that visitors would move through the space like water finding its natural course. Moss designed what they called listening stations, small alcoves where individual pieces of amber could rest in pools of soft light, accompanied not by explanatory labels, but by gentle invitations. "What season does this remind you of?" Or if you could whisper something to time itself, what would you say? Sage's role evolved from keeper to curator of experience, learning to arrange the amber not for visual impact, but for emotional resonance. A forest piece containing a delicate fern might rest beside an ocean specimen that hummed with patient resilience, creating conversations between different forms of ancient wisdom. The child who had once counted pieces with desperate anxiety now moved through the rooms with the careful attention of someone tending a garden of feelings, understanding that each placement was an invitation for hearts to discover their own preserved moments. The Museum of Moments opened without fanfare, its existence spreading through the coastal village like morning mist, gentle and pervasive. People came not as tourists seeking spectacle, but as pilgrims drawn by something they couldn't quite name. A space where time moved differently, where the boundary between memory and presence blurred into something approaching grace. They moved through the rooms with hushed voices and wondering eyes, many leaving with expressions that suggested they had remembered something beautiful. They hadn't known they'd forgotten. Sage learned to recognize the signs of genuine connection, the subtle shift in breathing when someone truly heard an amber's whisper, the way hands would pause and soften when understanding dawned, the quiet tears that spoke of recognition rather than sadness. In these moments, the old anxiety about protecting the collection transformed into profound joy at witnessing shared wonder. Each visitor who found their own story reflected in ancient light became part of the amber's continuing narrative, their hearts carrying forward the whispers that had waited millions of years to be heard. As autumn painted the world in shades of amber and gold, Sage would stand in the museum's central room during the quiet hour before closing, surrounded by specimens that glowed with contentment rather than desperate preservation. The monster within had completed its patient transformation, no longer a creature of grasping fear, but a wise guardian of sacred moments, understanding that true keeping meant creating space for others to discover their own capacity for wonder. In the amber-tinted peace of evening, with the lighthouse beam sweeping its eternal circle overhead, Sage felt the deep satisfaction of love that had learned to serve rather than possess, preservation that honored both permanence and change in the endless, gentle dance of time made visible in golden light. The Museum of Moments had settled into its gentle rhythm, like a heart learning to beat in harmony with larger tides, each day bringing visitors who left carrying pieces of wonder they hadn't known they were seeking. Sage moved through the amber-lit rooms with the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered that sharing multiplied rather than diminished treasure, and the monster within rested like a contented guardian, stirring only to purr approval when ancient whispers found exactly the hearts that needed to hear them. It was during one of those pearl-soft mornings when fog wrapped the lighthouse in silver silence that the letter arrived, carried by Coral's weathered hands, along with the scent of salt and distant shores. The envelope bore unfamiliar handwriting, careful and precise, and River read its contents twice before sharing them, watching Sage's face for signs of the old anxiety returning, but finding instead the steady attention of someone who had learned to listen before reacting. "A healer has written," River explained gently, settling beside Sage in the museum's dawn room, where morning light turned hanging specimens into gentle lanterns. "Dr. Mira works with people whose hearts are full of words they never got to say. Final conversations, interrupted by sudden loss, love taken before it could be fully expressed. She's heard about the amber's gift for preservation and wonders if it might help these unspoken words find their way to peace." The request stirred something deep in Sage's understanding, a resonance that felt like recognition rather than surprise. They had always known that amber held more than ancient specimens. It preserved the quality of moments, the essence of what it meant to be caught between ending and eternity. Perhaps that wisdom could serve hearts learning the terrible mathematics of loss, where love remained constant while its destination had vanished into mystery. When Dr. Mira arrived 3 days later, she came not with eager curiosity, but with the patient presence of someone who understood that sacred work required permission to unfold. Small and spare, with silver-streaked hair and eyes holding the gentle depth of someone who had learned to sit comfortably with sorrow, she moved through the museum with the reverent attention of someone reading prayers written in light. "I work at the edge of life," Dr. Mira explained as they sat together in the museum's ocean room, where Coral's specimens hummed with patient resilience. "There are words that long to be shared but find no voice, love that arrives too late for speaking aloud. The amber seems to understand something about preservation that might help these final whispers find their way to those who need to hear them." The first session happened on a morning when autumn light painted the cottage in shades of amber and gold. The elderly man who came was a violin maker named Oren, his weathered hands still graceful despite their trembling, his wife Leora holding them as if anchoring a small boat in uncertain tides. Sage chose a clear piece of amber with nothing caught inside, space ready for one simple glow, and settled beside the chair where love was preparing to take new form. "Keep the humble music," Oren whispered, voice catching on words that had been gathering like morning dew. "Eat warm bread slowly. Let mornings unfold without rushing. Your laugh sounds like the song I've been waiting my whole life to hear." The amber warmed in Sage's hands, pulsing gently, as if a distant chord had been struck true, its golden light growing brighter as love found its way to rest in ancient resin. When Leora held the amber later, she didn't hear a recording, but felt a warmth move through her bones, as if summer light had found her from a familiar window. Tears came like gentle rain, and something in her chest that had been holding its breath finally learned to exhale. The preserved moment wasn't trapping Oren's words, but giving them a place to continue their patient work of comfort. Like windows that remember light long after the sun has moved to bless other rooms. Through the weeks that followed, others came seeking the same strange solace. A young mother spoke to Forest Amber about the daughter she'd lost to fever, her words flowing like healing streams while specimens containing sleeping creatures seemed to pulse with gentle understanding. A grandfather whispered lullabies to pieces that held ancient leaves, sharing songs he'd never gotten to sing to grandchildren he'd never meet. The museum began to feel different, charged not just with ancient wonder, but with contemporary love finding its way to rest. Dr. Mira taught Sage to understand the sacred mathematics of this work, how love, unexpressed, could find completion through Amber's patient listening, how final words could be preserved, not as endings but as eternal conversations between hearts that refuse to be separated by something as temporary as physical absence. As winter painted the coastal village in shades of pearl and silver, Sage would stand in the museum during the quiet hour, after healing sessions, surrounded by specimens that hummed with contentment rather than simple preservation. The amber had discovered its highest purpose, not just keeping ancient moments safe, but creating space for contemporary love to find its eternal expression. The monster within, which had once fed on fear of losing precious things, now served as guardian of sacred conversations, understanding that true preservation meant not stopping love's flow but giving it endless places to rest and continue its patient, beautiful work of connection across the vast, gentle spaces of time. Winter wrapped the lighthouse in layers of pearl and silver, each morning bringing frost that painted the cottage windows in crystalline patterns that looked like captured breath. The season moved with the patient rhythm of deep tides, and within its quiet embrace, changes settled over the lighthouse cottage like snow finding its natural resting places. River moved through the daily rituals with a grace that had acquired new qualities. Movement slower but somehow more deliberate, as if each gesture had learned to carry the weight of accumulated wisdom. Sage noticed these changes in the spaces between moments, the way River's hand would pause on the stair rail before climbing to tend the light, or how the lighthouse keeper's breathing had acquired a different rhythm during the long winter evenings. There was nothing alarming in these shifts, only the natural settling that comes when someone has spent decades in service to something larger than themselves, like driftwood that has been polished smooth by countless tides until it achieves a perfect balance between strength and grace. It was during these quiet winter days that River began sharing the deeper lessons that could only be spoken in whispers, truths too delicate for ordinary conversation, but strong enough to carry the weight of a lifetime's gentle observation. They would sit together in the cottage's warmest corner, where the lighthouse mechanism's rhythmic turning created a meditation bell that marked time in 30-second intervals, and River would speak of the wisdom that lived in the spaces between light and darkness. "The beacon we tend here," River said one afternoon, as snow painted the world in shades of silence, "has guided ships for more years than either of us has been breathing. Each keeper learns the same secret. The light isn't meant to hold vessels in place, but to help them find their way safely through darkness, toward whatever harbor calls their name." The words settled into Sage's understanding like seeds finding fertile ground, beginning the slow work of teaching that preservation and guidance might be different expressions of the same deep love. River began inviting Sage to join the lighthouse duties with a formality that felt like blessing, showing them how to tend the great lens with cloth soft as breath, how to listen to the clockwork's patient voice, how to trust the mechanism's ancient wisdom while remaining alert to its needs. "The secret," River explained while demonstrating the careful cleaning of each facet, "is to honor what the light wants. It doesn't belong to us. It passes through us, and our job is to keep the path clear." These lessons extended beyond the mechanical into something approaching the sacred. River taught Sage to read weather in the quality of air pressure, to understand when fog would require the horn's patient voice, to recognize the difference between storms that demanded preparation and those that asked only for trust. Each skill was offered not as mastery to be achieved, but as service to be rendered. Another way of learning that true keeping meant creating space for essential things to do their work. Through the long winter evenings, as the lighthouse beam painted moving shadows across frost-covered gardens, River shared stories of other keepers who had understood this deeper purpose. There was the woman who had planted night-blooming flowers around the lighthouse base, offering beauty to those who worked in darkness. Another had carved small wooden boats for village children, teaching them that some journeys were meant to be taken again and again. Each story carried the same gentle wisdom, that true service happened when preservation became a form of generous guidance. The amber collection seemed to respond to these deepening insights, the specimens in both cottage and museum glowing with a different quality of light, warmer and more welcoming, as if ancient resin had learned to express hospitality as well as preservation. Sage began to see their work with different eyes, understanding that the Museum of Moments wasn't just preserving specimens or facilitating healing conversations. It was serving as a lighthouse of its own kind, helping people navigate the difficult waters between memory and hope, between holding on and letting go. One evening, as wind sang through the lighthouse tower with the voice of distant tides, River sat beside Sage among the hanging specimens and reached into their pocket with the careful attention of someone handling something infinitely precious. What emerged was a small cloth parcel, folded as carefully as prayers, and when River opened it, Sage saw a shard of old lens glass, curved like the edge of a moon, its edges softened by years of pockets and patient polishing. A keeper before me carried this when the main lens was being restored, River explained. Voice carrying the weight of tradition passed hand to hand across generations. They said it remembered every beam it ever bent, every ship it helped find safe harbor. I've kept it near my heart through storms and calms, but it wants a new pocket. Now. River placed the glass shard in Sage's, palm with a look that felt like a doorway, opening both ways. The lens fragment caught the lantern's glow and scattered it in. Miniature rainbows that painted Sage's wrist with gentle color. Heat rose through their fingers, familiar as the warmth of amber but somehow different, thinner, more like breath made tangible. Beneath that surface warmth, another heat answered from Sage's own chest, quiet and steady. The same rhythm they had felt in the museum when healing words found their rest, the same patient interval as the lighthouse beam itself. Every keeper eventually faces the same question, River continued, settling back among the amber, with the satisfied exhaustion of someone who had carried important truths for years, and finally found the right moment to share them. When the time comes to pass the light to other hands, how do we let go of what we've loved so deeply, while trusting it to continue its work of guidance? The question settled into Sage's heart, like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that would take time to reach the shore. In the amber-tinted quiet that followed, Sage felt the monster within stirring not with familiar hunger, but with something approaching curiosity. The creature of possession and protection was learning to ask different questions, not how to hold on to what was precious, but how to ensure that precious things could continue their work of service, even when the hands that had tended them could no longer reach. The understanding bloomed slowly, like dawn light gradually filling a room, that all keeping was temporary. All love was meant to flow toward whatever hearts most needed its gentle, persistent illumination. The lighthouse beam swept overhead in its eternal rhythm, and the amber answered with warm pulses of honeyed light. Ancient preservation learning to dance gracefully with the truth that guidance and letting go were not enemies, but partners in love's endless, patient work of helping beautiful things find their way safely through darkness, toward whatever harbor called their name. The lens fragment rested against Sage's heart through the quiet days that followed, its curved surface warming to the rhythm of breath and pulse, like a small creature learning to trust its new home. Each morning brought subtle shifts in understanding, as if the ancient glass was teaching lessons too delicate for words, how light could be guided without being captured, how preservation could serve passage rather than possession. The amber collection seemed to recognize this new presence, specimens glowing with what felt like gentle approval, their golden light pulsing in harmony with the lens shard's patient warmth. Winter's grip softened into the tentative promise of spring, and with it came changes that settled over Sage's heart, like morning dew finding thirsty ground. The child who had once moved through the cottage with desperate inventory now walked with a different quality of attention, hands reaching not to count or control, but to listen for what each piece might need. The monster within, which had prowled so long with protective hunger, began to reveal itself not as something fearsome, but as a frightened child who had loved so deeply that it could only express that love through grasping. In quiet moments, Sage would hold both lens shard and amber piece together, feeling how one bent light while the other held it, how both served illumination through different forms of patient service. The recognition bloomed slowly, like sunrise gradually filling a room. The creature they had thought was monstrous had never been evil, only afraid. Afraid that beauty would vanish, that precious moments would be lost, that love unexpressed would disappear into time's endless current. Understanding this brought not victory but tenderness, the kind of gentle compassion reserved for wounded things learning to heal. The transformation manifested in countless small permissions. Sage began asking the amber different questions, not "what are you?" but "how would you like to be today?" The specimens seemed to exhale with relief, their arrangements shifting from rigid protection to generous conversation. Some pieces asked for quiet corners, where they could rest in contemplative shadow. Others yearned to greet visitors at the threshold, their light dancing with welcoming warmth. The museum breathed differently, hair flowing with the ease that comes when beauty is trusted to know its own purpose. River watched these changes with the satisfied attention of someone who had planted seeds and now witnessed their patient flowering. The lighthouse keeper began sharing deeper wisdom during their daily rituals, teaching Sage to read the mechanism's subtle moods, to understand when the great lens needed encouragement and when it preferred to be trusted with its ancient rhythms. "The hardest lesson," River said one evening as they polished the beacon's facets together, "is learning that true keeping means creating space for precious things to do their work, even when that work carries them beyond our immediate reach." Through the lengthening days, Sage discovered their own heart undergoing its deepest transformation. Like amber itself, it was becoming clarified rather than hardened, not brittle with protection but luminous with understanding. The desperate need to preserve every moment of beauty began to settle into something wiser, the recognition that some things were meant to be experienced and released, their value lying not in permanent capture, but in the quality of attention they received during their brief, precious passage. Visitors to the museum began commenting on the change, describing the space as feeling more alive, more welcoming. Children would gravitate toward specimens that seemed to hum with particular contentment, while adults found themselves lingering in conversations with amber that felt less like observation and more like communion. When someone expressed deep connection with a particular piece, Sage found themselves offering it not as gift or sale, but as continuation of its journey, understanding that stories grew richer when shared rather than hoarded. Ren noticed the transformation in the quality of light itself, how it moved through the museum rooms with greater freedom, painting walls and visitors in patterns that seemed to celebrate rather than simply illuminate. Their watercolors began capturing not just the amber's physical beauty, but the generous spirit that now animated the space, pigments flowing across paper like joy made visible. "So you're not fighting the current anymore," Ren observed one afternoon, watching Sage guide a child's hand to a piece that held an ancient flower. "You're learning to be the riverbank that helps it flow." The healing sessions with Dr. Mira took on new depth, as Sage understood that the amber wasn't just preserving final words but teaching the grieving how to carry love without the burden of possession. They began explaining this to visitors, not through grand pronouncements but gentle whispers, helping them discover their own capacity for holding light while letting it continue its patient work of connection across time's vast, gentle distances. As evening painted the cottage in shades of amber and rose, Sage would stand among the collection with a feeling too complex for simple words. The specimens were fewer now. Some had been gifted to hearts that truly heard their stories. Others had been returned to coral for ocean journeys. Still others had simply departed with weather or time. Yet somehow the space felt fuller rather than emptier, alive with stories that had been shared rather than hoarded, breathing with the rhythm of preservation that served passage rather than fought it. The lighthouse beam swept its eternal circle overhead, and the amber answered with warm pulses of honeyed light. Not preservation battling time, but ancient patience learning to dance gracefully within time's endless flow. In that amber-tinted piece, Sage felt the monster within settle into contentment, no longer a creature of desperate protection, but a wise guardian of sacred continuance, understanding that the deepest love expressed itself not through grasping but through the courage to trust beautiful things, to know their own way through darkness toward whatever harbor called their name. The lens fragment had been teaching its patient lessons through the weeks that followed River's sharing, its curved surface warming against Sage's chest like a small creature learning to trust its new home. Each morning brought subtle shifts in understanding, as if the ancient glass was whispering truths too delicate for ordinary conversation, how light could be guided without being captured, how preservation could serve passage rather than possession. But it was during one of those pearl-soft mornings, when spring mist wrapped the lighthouse in silver veils, that Sage made a discovery that would change everything. While arranging the forest specimens in their morning ritual of gentle attention, small fingers brushed against their own chest and felt something unexpected, a warmth that seemed to pulse in harmony with both lens fragment and amber, but deeper, more personal, as if their own heart had learned to glow with the same patient light that had drawn them to ancient resin from their very first breath. The recognition bloomed slowly, like sunrise painting fog in shades of wonder. The Sage's heart had become like amber, not hardened by years of desperate preservation, but clarified, holding light and memory with gentle strength, while allowing both to flow through rather than demanding they remain trapped. It was Ren who helped this understanding take visible form, arriving that afternoon with an idea that sparkled in their forest pool eyes like sunlight on water. "What if we painted the garden through a whole year?" they suggested, setting up their easel among the hanging specimens with the reverent attention of someone proposing a sacred collaboration. Not to capture it, but to witness how it keeps becoming itself in different lights, different seasons. The same amber, but always new stories depending on who's looking and when. Through the days that followed, they began this patient work of witnessing time itself. Ren would arrive each morning, sometimes before dawn, sometimes in the honey-thick light of afternoon, always with fresh watercolors and paper that seemed chosen for the particular quality of that day's illumination. Sage learned to arrange the amber, not for permanent display but for conversation with whatever light was offering itself, understanding that each specimen might want to greet morning differently than it welcomed dusk. The first paintings captured spring's tentative promises, pale golds leaning into milk-white mist, shadows with edges like kindness. Sage watched Ren work with the patient attention they had once reserved for amber alone, but now extended to this dance between pigment and paper, between intention and accident. When afternoon rain began to fall on one of the watercolors, transforming it in real time, Sage felt something in their chest uncurl with recognition. "It's still beautiful," they whispered, watching colors run and blend in patterns no brush could have achieved. Different beautiful, but not less. Summer brought bolder truths to their collaborative witnessing. The amber garden blazed with confident light, each hanging specimen catching sun and throwing it back transformed. Ren's strokes grew clearer yet never rigid, blues deepening until they held green within them, golds becoming the color of warm tea and honey. Sage began to understand that they were documenting not just seasonal change, but the endless conversation between preservation and transformation, between the amber's ancient patience and the living light that danced through it moment by moment. As the series grew, visitors began arriving not just to witness individual paintings, but to experience the flow between them. Each canvas showed the same garden, yet each was entirely unique, capturing how light fell differently, how wind moved the specimens in unrepeatable patterns, how the surrounding world bloomed and faded in its own rhythm. More profoundly, the amber pieces themselves seemed to shift and change from painting to painting, as if they too were alive and flowing through time's patient current. "The garden teaches me," Ren said one evening, as autumn painted the world in shades of rust and gold, "that even preserved moments continue to grow and change through the eyes that witness them. Your amber holds ancient light, but it's the light of this moment, this viewer, this season, that makes it truly sing." They spoke of how a particular piece containing a perfectly preserved leaf might speak of vibrant life to one person, gentle surrender to another, or quiet promise of renewal to a third, all true, all valid, all part of the amber's ongoing story. Their friendship deepened through this shared work into something that felt both steady and flowing, like a river that maintains its essential character while adapting to every stone and curve in its path. Sage began to understand that their relationship with Ren was teaching the same lessons as the amber itself, that love wasn't about possessing someone in a single, perfect moment, but about witnessing them in all their changing forms, appreciating the beauty of their growth, understanding that the love itself was the constant, even as its expression transformed. Standing before the completed series one winter evening, with the lighthouse beam painting moving shadows across canvases that captured a year's worth of patient attention, Sage felt the final piece of understanding settle into place. Each painting is true, they murmured, but none of them are the whole truth. The truth is in the flowing between them, in the way they hold space for everything that changes while honoring what endures. The monster within, which had prowled so long with protective hunger, settled into its final form, not creature of grasping fear, but wise guardian of flowing light, understanding that the deepest keeping meant becoming the kind of person who could help precious things find their way safely through time's endless dance. In the amber-tinted peace of evening, surrounded by art that celebrated both permanence and change, Sage felt their own heart pulsing with the warm certainty of ancient resin that had learned to hold light without dimming it, to offer sanctuary without demanding permanence, to love deeply enough to trust beautiful things to know their own way through whatever seasons called their names. The understanding that had bloomed in Sage's heart through the year of paintings, that their own essence had become like amber, clarified rather than hardened, was still settling into bone-deep wisdom when the letter arrived. It came not with Coral's weathered hands, but through official channels, its maritime seal speaking of changes too large for village whispers to contain. River read the contents twice in the amber-tinted morning light, then folded the paper with the careful attention of someone tucking a difficult truth into a safe place until it could be properly examined. The lighthouse would be automated by summer's end, its ancient clockwork heart replaced by systems that required no human tending, no keeper's cottage, no gentle hands to polish the great lens or listen to the beacon's patient voice. River's service, which had spanned decades of storms and calms, would complete itself when technicians arrived to install equipment that could guide ships with electronic precision rather than human devotion. The keeper's cottage would stand empty for the first time in generations, waiting for whatever family might eventually call it home. Sage felt the news settle into their chest like morning dew finding thirsty ground, not as shock, but as recognition of a tide that had been gathering strength beyond the horizon for longer than either of them had admitted. The monster within, which had learned so much about releasing what was precious, stirred with something approaching curiosity rather than fear. Here was the deepest lesson of all, asking not whether they could trust individual amber pieces to find new homes, but whether they could trust the entire life they had built to continue its essential work even when the structure that had supported it transformed beyond recognition. River moved through the days that followed with a grace that held both sorrow and acceptance, like driftwood that had been polished by countless tides until it achieved perfect balance between strength and surrender. They began speaking of the transition not as ending, but as the natural completion of one form of service, making space for new forms to emerge. The light itself will remain, River explained one evening as they sat among the hanging amber, the lighthouse mechanism marking time in 30-second intervals that suddenly felt precious rather than eternal. It will simply learn to tend itself, the way the amber learned to share its stories without needing us to translate every whisper. When the technicians arrived, they came with soft voices and respectful hands, carrying careful cases and an understanding that they were inheriting something sacred rather than simply installing equipment. River invited them to witness the lighthouse's rhythms before changing them, and Sage watched with wonder as these practical strangers moved around the great lens with the reverence of people entering a cathedral. The new motor would be modest and patient, taking the weight of night watchers while honoring the beam's eternal purpose of guiding travelers safely through darkness. And the evening of the final hand-winding became a quiet ceremony, without anyone planning it that way. Ren arrived with thermos and gentle presence. Moss brought practical wisdom wrapped in understanding smiles, and Coral appeared at the door carrying the scent of sea wind and pine smoke. Dr. Mira came at dusk, with her healing hands folded in patient attention, and together they climbed the spiral, stares one last time to witness River complete the ancient ritual of preparing light for its night's work. River placed the winding key in Sage's palm with the same reverence they had once used for the lens fragment, understanding that some traditions were meant to be passed hand to hand, rather than simply abandoned. Together they wound the clockwork heart, feeling its familiar resistance and hearing its satisfied settling into rhythm. When Sage's finger touched the switch that would invite the new system to share the vigil, the lens fragment warmed against their chest, as if offering blessing to this marriage of old wisdom and new capability. Through the weeks that followed, letting go became a liturgy of small choices made with love rather than loss. Some amber pieces hummed with quiet contentment when arranged in the museum spaces that would continue their work of connecting hearts to ancient stories. Others, particularly Coral's ocean specimens, pulsed with longing for movement, for the possibility of carrying their whispers to distant shores where other listeners might be waiting. Sage learned to ask each piece what it wanted, rather than deciding what it needed, understanding that true keeping meant honoring the amber's own intelligence about where its stories could serve most. Faithfully, River's cottage in the village waited with windows that looked out over the sea, where the lighthouse beam could still be witnessed without needing to be tended. As moving day approached, Sage helped pack decades of careful observation, logbooks filled with weather patterns and quiet reflections, tools polished smooth by years of devoted service, charts marked with the patient notations of someone who had learned to read the sea's moods like scripture. Each object received its own small blessing, its own acknowledgement of service completed with grace. On the final morning, as fog wrapped the lighthouse in silver veils that made sound seem closer and more intimate, Sage stood in the cottage surrounded by amber that glowed with contentment rather than anxiety. The specimens pulsed gently, not as possessions being abandoned, but as stories preparing for their next chapter of service. The lighthouse beam swept its eternal circle overhead, and the ancient resin answered with warm light that spoke not of endings but of transformations, not of loss but of love, learning new vocabularies for its patient. Endless work of connection across time's vast gentle distances. The monster within, which had once prowled with desperate protection, settled into deep contentment, understanding finally that true keeping meant not clinging to familiar forms, but trusting precious things to find their way to whatever hands and hearts could serve them best. In the amber-tinted piece of transition, Sage felt their own heart pulsing with the warm certainty of ancient resin that had learned to hold light without dimming it, to offer sanctuary without demanding permanence, to love deeply enough to trust beautiful things to know their own way through whatever seasons called their names. The understanding that had settled into Sage's heart, like morning dew finding thirsty ground, continued to deepen through the seasons that followed, each one teaching new lessons about the dance between preservation and passage. The lighthouse beam swept its eternal circle with electronic precision now, but somehow retained the soul that decades of human devotion had woven into its light. River's cottage in the village learned their footsteps the way a shoreline learns the pattern of faithful tides, and from its windows, the former keeper could still witness the beacon they had tended for so long, continuing its patient work of guidance across dark waters. Years passed like gentle currents, each one smoothing the edges of old anxieties, while revealing new depths of understanding. Sage grew into their role not as keeper, but as curator of flowing wonder, moving through the museum of moments, with the quiet grace of someone who had discovered that true preservation meant creating space for stories to continue their work of healing and connection. The lens fragment still rested against their heart, its curved surface warm with accumulated blessings, her bridge between one keeper's faithful service and another's patient flowering into wisdom. The museum had evolved beyond its original vision, becoming a sanctuary where people came not just to witness preserved beauty, but to learn the art of holding precious things lightly. Dr. Mira's healing work continued in the ocean room, where final words found their rest in golden resin, while grieving hearts discovered that love could be carried without the burden of possession. Children would arrive with their own collections, shells and stones and pressed flowers, learning through Amber's example that treasures grew more beautiful when shared rather than hoarded. Wren's studio had grown to encompass both watercolor and amber, creating collaborative pieces where ancient preservation met contemporary flow in conversations. that honored both permanence and change. Their love had deepened into something that felt both steady and dancing, like morning light that maintains its essential warmth while adapting to every surface it touches. Together they would walk the shore in the early hours, occasionally discovering new pieces of amber that the sea offered with its own mysterious timing, each specimen arriving when hearts were ready to hear its particular whisper. Coral still brought gifts from his ocean journeys, but now they were offerings for the museum's growing collection, rather than additions to desperate hoarding. Each piece carried stories of distant shores and patient currents, teaching visitors that preservation was part of a larger conversation between time and memory. Moss had established a network of similar spaces along the coast, small sanctuaries where people could learn to listen to the whispers of preserved time, each location developing its own character, while sharing the fundamental understanding that true collection meant creating space for treasures to do their work of connection. River often visited, their presence a comforting anchor in the ever-flowing stream of life. They would sit among the amber, weathered hands resting on smooth sea glass, eyes holding the distant look of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the sea's moods like scripture. The light finds its way, River would often say, a simple truth that resonated deeply with Sage's understanding. No matter how the storm rages, no matter how the shore changes, the light finds its way. On quiet evenings, when the last visitors had departed and the amber glowed in peaceful contentment, Sage would stand among the specimens with a feeling too complex for simple words. The collection was smaller now than it had been in the desperate days of trying to preserve every moment of beauty, yet somehow the space felt more alive, more generous, breathing with the rhythm of stories that had found their way to exactly the hearts that needed to hear them. The monster within had completed its transformation so thoroughly that Sage sometimes forgot it had ever been anything other than a wise guardian of flowing light. The creature that had once prowled with protective hunger now rested like a contented cat in the warm spaces of the heart, stirring only to purr approval when ancient whispers found perfect resonance with contemporary need. Fear of loss had transformed into trust in continuation. Desperate grasping had become generous guidance, and the terrible weight of trying to stop time had dissolved into the grace of helping beautiful things find their way safely through time's patient, endless dance. When storms would sweep the coast, Sage no longer felt the old panic about protecting the collection. Instead, they would stand at the museum windows and watch the amber garden dance with wind and rain, understanding that some pieces might choose to join the tempest's larger choreography, while others would weather the weather with ancient patience. Each choice was honored, each departure blessed, each arrival welcomed as part of the ongoing conversation between preservation and passage. The lighthouse beams swept overhead on such evenings, and the amber answered with warm pulses of honeyed light that spoke not of endings, but of endless becoming, not of capture, but of communion, not of possession, but of the deepest form of love, the kind that trusts precious things to know their own way through darkness toward whatever harbor calls their name. In that amber-tinted piece, surrounded by light that moved like breathing, Sage understood that they had become what they had always been meant to be, not a keeper of things, but a tender of the spaces where beauty could rest safely, while continuing its patient work of connection across the vast, gentle distances of time, and somewhere in the golden glow, the ancient whispers continued their eternal song, stories held not in amber's grip, but in amber's grace, preserved faithfully enough to guide other hearts toward their own capacity for wonder in the endless, beautiful dance of time made visible in light. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.